Okay, well, good evening or good morning or wherever you are at this time of day. Welcome to our event. I'm glad to see a lot of people here. I'm Jan Nelson. I'm the convener of the Western Methodist Justice Movement. I'm a lay member of the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference. And just a bit about Western Methodist Justice Movement, for those of you who don't know us very well. We came together about 12 years ago as a formal group after meeting informally at jurisdictional conferences for many years and saying, maybe we should do something more than once every 4 years to help increase justice. We work in and beyond the church. We try to make sure that our leadership team represents all the conferences of the Western jurisdiction, but we also recognize that many of our concerns are not specific, and we welcome people from everywhere that share a passion for justice and want to work with us. So the reason for this event, and as you know, the General Conference passed a lot of important legislation at the session in Charlotte last spring. Some of that legislation amends the church constitution, and those items have to be ratified by 2/3 of the annual conference members across the whole jurisdiction, whole connection. Those votes will happen at annual conference sessions starting after January 1st. And we know that not all annual conference members pay close attention to what General Conference does, so there's a big need to educate our members about what they'll be voting on. The reason we're doing this webinar right now is that many churches are now in the process of choosing their annual conference lay members who will actually be the ones voting. And especially for new starts at that, we thought it was important to start the education now. We hope that all of us will make sure our own congregations choose people who are committed to making informed votes on these amendments and people who will actually be present and voting. We know there are other groups working on the ratification effort. We intend to work with them and not in competition with them, but we wanted to get a start on this as soon as possible. Our webinar tonight is being recorded. We'll get some information at the end about, well, we'll figure out how to let you know where the recording is. It will be posted on the WMJM website along with some other resources. We know that you will have questions, and as we go through the presentations, please feel free to put your questions in the chat anytime. Members of our leadership team are going to monitor the chat, and they'll lift up questions as much as there's time for when we have our Q&A time later in the session. I want to thank all of the leadership team members that are here tonight and their various roles right now. I'd like to thank Greg Nelson, who's our tech guy for this. He's the communications manager for WMJM, and he will keep us moving technically, and if all goes well, you'll never hear from him. Also, this is a good time to remind you to keep yourself muted, and if and when it's your turn to talk, you'll have to unmute yourself. And at this time, I'd like to invite Jessica Rooks, who is a member of our leadership team from the Mountain Sky Conference, to open us with a word of prayer.
Thanks, Jan. I wanted to start us off with a blessing from John O'Donohue's book, To Bless the Space Between Us. And it's a blessing for a new beginning. Regionalization can be a new beginning for us. And so invite you to hear this blessing for a new beginning. And out of the way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander. This beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you were ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight, when your courage kindled, and out you stepped onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon you will be at home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. Might we all sense the world that awaits us as a denomination and as people of God. Amen.
Jan, you're muted.
We're going to start our presentations with a bit of explanation about the process. And to start that off, Richard Bentley, who's also a member of our leadership team and a clergy member from the CalPAC conference, is going to explain a little bit about aggregate voting.
Okay, and I have a slide. The first thing to know about aggregate voting is that all members of the annual conference who are present can vote, both lay and clergy. And the first step to pass constitutional amendments is for the General Conference to approve them by 2/3 vote. And then we go through this very strange process called aggregate voting, where all of the members of all of the annual conferences across the worldwide Methodist Church get to cast a ballot. And it takes a 2/3 vote of everybody who voted to approve a constitutional amendment. So on the slide, you'll notice there are, I think, 56 annual conferences in the US, but there's been some mergers, so that should be off. There are 33 annual conferences in Africa, 26 in Europe, in the Philippines, and Europe, depending on where they are with disaffiliations, would either be 20 or 17. So that's how many annual conferences will be voting in the aggregate voting process. And it's, yeah, and so somehow we will record in your annual conference session, they will record all the votes in favor and all of the votes against a particular constitutional amendment. Those votes will be sealed. Rob will sealed. We will not, you won't know how your conference voted. And I want to emphasize that it is not 2/3 of the annual conferences approved. It is 2/3 of everybody who votes. But because of the nature of aggregate voting, if you get a lot of yes votes in one annual conference, it can compensate for no votes in another annual conference. Thank you, Greg. And you get this, you see this, that in some conferences, there's more yes votes, in some conferences, more no votes, but we tipped the scale and we got a 2/3 aggregate vote in this picture. For those of you in the Western jurisdiction, we tend to have very large annual conferences because we tend to have lots of clergy members, and with lay equalization, we have one lay person for every clergy person. So the Western jurisdiction has the possibility of having a significant impact because of the large size of our annual conferences, as opposed to some of the annual conferences, for example, in the Philippines, which are closer to the size of the district. All of their votes will count, but they may only have 50 to 75 votes. 200 votes they're counting, as opposed to our 600 to 700 to 800 votes. So that's aggregate voting. You can put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them later.
Thank you, Richard. Our next presentation is going to maybe answer a few more of the questions about that. Our presenter is Bob Rhodes, who is the conference secretary for the CalPAC annual conference. And we know that not all of the things about voting are known at this time, but Bob is going to tell us everything that we do know about voting now. And some of it's a little complicated, and I see there are already questions in the chat. So Bob, go ahead.
Hi, friends. Please first hear my word of gratitude for the opportunity to share my knowledge with you. I do want to be transparent that I do not come as a representative of the General Conference. I come as a leader within the California Pacific Annual Conference, bringing sort of our experience and my understanding. I just want to name that I'm not the authority person here. First, you may already know that the amendments and how we affirm those amendments are guided by paragraph 59 in our Book of Discipline, which says that amendments to the Constitution shall be made upon a 2/3 majority of the General Conference present and voting, and a 2/3 affirmative vote of the aggregate number of members of the several annual conferences present and voting, except in the case of first and second restrictive rules, which shall require a 3/4 majority of all the members of the annual conferences present and voting. I think maybe I can pause and I don't need to read all of this, because really what I've read already has all the information that we need. So as Richard noted about aggregate voting, that gives us a lot of information. Any constitutional amendment, no matter where it came from, must go through the General Conference and must be affirmed by a 2/3 majority and then be ratified by the annual conferences. And that's where Richard's excellent teaching about aggregate voting comes in. Now, I know that there were a couple of conversations or questions in the chat. Who is it that can vote related to constitutional amendments? And as Richard noted, yes, all clergy members can vote. Well, almost all. Provisional members cannot vote, at least according to my notes, cannot vote on constitutional amendments. Elders and deacons in full connection may vote. Elders and deacons in full connection, even if they're on a leave, even an involuntary leave, may vote on constitutional amendments. Lay members elected by local churches, Wesley foundations, districts, specified leadership roles, lay members may vote, and appointed deaconesses and home missioners and diaconal ministers, active and retired, may vote on constitutional amendments. I know there was one question about whether or not a lay person assigned could vote. No, I'm afraid that person would not be able to vote. Certified lay ministers would not be eligible to vote in that particular setting as a lay person assigned. However, if they are a certified lay minister who is elected by a congregation, then they would be duly elected, and my sense is they would be able to vote. Now, what will be the process in terms of how will we manage this in our various annual conferences? And I will tell you, we don't have that information yet from the General Conference. And so I'm going to tell you how I expect it to go. We will receive some kind of ballot. And I say some kind with leaving space for, will it be a paper ballot or will we be able to vote digitally? I don't know the answer to that question. Perhaps your annual conference meets exclusively in person. Perhaps your annual conference meets exclusively online. Perhaps your annual conference, like CalPAC, meets in a hybrid setting. All those things impact whether or not, for instance, a paper ballot would be accessible to all participants. We don't know the answer to that question. So what I will tell you is whatever that ballot is, that ballot will be distributed to those persons who are eligible to vote. The vote will be received, and then, as Richard noted, that vote will not be reported back to your annual conference. That's an important thing because we don't want to influence other annual conferences. So that vote will not be reported back to the annual conference. It will be returned to the General Conference, particularly the bishops. The bishops will, sort of do the final tally on all of the votes, as Richard noted, related to aggregate voting, and then we'll announce the results of that vote. That's the basic process. It has to be approved in the General Conference by 2/3. Then annual conferences must affirm by 2/3 of the aggregate votes. Then it's moved on to the Council of Bishops, Once they count up all those votes, then it will be announced. And as of that moment of announcement, it will be officially changed. So I hope that's clear. I will be paying attention to the chat if I can respond to any questions that are in there. And again, thank you for this opportunity to take a moment to address you.
Thank you, Bob.
Bob, did you want to share that other graph?
Which one?
The big chart?
The chart, yes. So this is a chart that we use in CalPAC. Thank you for that reminder. This is a chart that we use in CalPAC. It actually has more information than you would need for this. I want to tell you, I understand that this chart, all the text is too small. That's okay. We're going to put a link to this chart in the chat. This is the voting rights of clergy and lay members that our statistician in our annual conference put together. If you see those colors on the top, those are just the colors that we use on badges and voting materials for our members of the annual conference. But there is a row in there specifically related to constitutional amendments. Again, I know this slide has text that's too small to read on the screen. However, we can put a link to this in the chat to one of our annual conference pages. You can download this and zoom in and take a look at this. One of the things that's included in this that's really helpful all the way at the bottom are the disciplinary paragraphs that guide all the information in there, including whether or not those persons are able to vote on constitutional amendments. Thanks for the reminder to reference this. And again, you should be able to find this link to this in the chat.
Thank you, Bob. That's really helpful, about as helpful as we know right now. One of my big questions is we'll be able to vote digitally, and I don't like your answer, but I understand it. Now we're going to move into a time of explaining the amendments themselves, and there are several of them. And I want to briefly introduce the presenters for that before we start, and then we'll just move right through one at a time. Reverend Izzy Alvaron is a clergy member of the CalPAC conference. He's an organizer for Reconciling Ministries Network, and he's also a member of our leadership team. Junie Keniston has served as a Connectional Ministries Officer, the Chief Connectional Ministries Officer of the Connectional Table since January of 2023, but she's been working on regionalization proposals since 2013, and I think she'll talk a little more about that in her presentation. Emily Allen is going to talk about one of the other amendments. Emily's a lay member of the California-Nevada Conference. She served from 2016 to 2024 on the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women. Giovanni Arroyo, Reverend Giovanni Arroyo, is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Religion and Race, and he will talk about another amendment. And then Reverend Andy Emanuel is a clergy member in the Nigeria Episcopal area. He's currently serving as the assistant to the interim bishop, and he's joining us in the middle of the night, and he'll give us a little bit of information about how things are going in Africa with regard to ratification. So we will begin with Izzy and talking about regionalization.
Okay, thank you. Just a brief overview, and then I'll pass it on to Judy, our fearless leader of the Connectional Table. Regionalization planning and legislation preparation has been underway for years, and United Methodists from around the world have been part of its development. The Connectional Table was tasked to develop legislation to create a U.S. regional conference. And Judy Keniston, one of our panelists, before becoming top executive of the Connectional Table, led this effort starting in 2013. So this has been going on. In 2019, the U.S. as a regional conference legislation was set to be presented to what was supposed to be the 2020 General Conference, also inspired the development of the Christmas Covenant regionalization legislation led by many Central Conference grassroots leaders. I've been convening that team since. Now, this expanded regionalization petition extends to Central Conferences. And in collaboration, later on, in collaboration with the Connectional Table, the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, and of course, this grassroots team, Worldwide regionalization legislation was submitted to the General Conference that met in Charlotte earlier this year, 2024, and was submitted by the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. And an overwhelming majority of General Conference delegates adopted the plan. Now we have to ratify the constitutional amendments. So I'll pass it on to Judy.
Thank you, Izzy. I appreciate that. And thank you to the hosts of this event who have worked to bring this about. And I really appreciate the work that's gone into it. And thank you also for all of you who have shown an interest in learning about regionalization and the other amendments that are coming before us. As was mentioned, I have personally worked on regionalization since 2013, and then in 2016, the connectional table has made this since 2016, the connectional table has made this a priority to work with the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters to make a place for the U.S. to do the adaptable work required by the General Book of Discipline that they have been working on, and which we have a draft of already, and they're taking input on the General Book of Discipline. And the reason that's really significant is that as we work on regions that can adapt to the Book of Discipline and what they can adapt, that comes from the work that is being done on the General Book of Discipline and what can be adapted and how that's going to happen. So all of that, it's all working together and coming about at a little bit different times. I wish we already had the General Book of Discipline, but we don't. But we now, at least when we know what can be adapted, we're ready to do that with the regions, provided we have the ratification. When this legislation passed at General Conference, I was overcome with emotion. There were a few of us who had worked on the U.S. as a regional conference legislation, and we were texting each other and just amazed that this had happened and that we were here. And I did allow myself to celebrate that day, even though I realized that the work we had to do coming forward with ratification was just beginning. So I've been fascinated by the history of regionalization and the call for decentering the U.S. and the need for our church to view its mission and ministry from a global perspective. And while I worked primarily on providing a place for the U.S. to deal with its stuff that comes at General Conference and all that legislation that's U.S.-centric, others also recognize the need for a regional approach. And as Izzy said, those groups had worked together to present what was presented at General Conference and passed by greater than the 2/3 majority. So it's been a lot of people coming together. We've been incredibly fortunate to have the coalition that's brought this far. And now we're ready to climb the next mountain, which and that involves education. I think those in the Western jurisdiction for getting a head start on this, because it's going to be really important that we educate the U.S. Members to annual conference, the lay and clergy members of every annual conference. They need to know what they're voting on, and most of those are still being elected through charge conferences. So when that happens and when we know who they are, I think those efforts will need to increase. But we're also at this, actually today and tomorrow, we have a training going on in Africa with the communicators and members from their annual from each of the annual conferences, as much as we could get there. Andy is there, and maybe we'll be able to tell us a little bit more about what's happening today and also what's happening. And even though it's in the middle of the night for him, he's doing double duty in these days, and we're grateful for that. We'll be having a similar training coming up in the Philippines in next month, and some work there that Izzy and others are doing. And so I'm just really grateful for all of that work throughout all the regions. I hope you will be a part of this in your annual conferences as it comes forward. So I was going to mention how the ratification works, but I think that Richard and David have covered that really well. But so I will talk about what we're actually going to be voting on. We had at General Conference, there were 8 petitions that came forward. It was all in calendar item 22. And that was passed by a total of 586 to 164 on April 25th. It had come from the Standing Committee with a unanimous 29 to nothing vote. So it was brought to the floor and it passed overwhelmingly in the first week, which was, I mean, I think it was just a shock to many of us. And as I had already said, just overwhelmingly exciting to know that. So the 8 petitions that came through. The first dealt with the constitutional changes, and I'll cover those briefly in a moment. The second dealt with the changes to the Book of Discipline that are necessitated by the constitutional changes. So because when we change the Constitution, then all these other parts of the discipline also have to change. The third petition was enabling legislation that allowed us to update paragraph 2201. That's the standing information on the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters, including the name of that group. The fourth petition will replace the word Central Conference with Regional Conference everywhere in the discipline after the constitutional amendments are ratified. So that's provided already that will happen. And then the 5th, 6th, and 7th petitions were the ones that came dealing with the U.S. as a regional conference. Petition 5 created a new paragraph that would establish an interim U.S. regional committee. Then there are 2 non-disciplinary petitions, one creating that interim U.S. regional committee, and another that would plan the organization of the U.S. regional conference, provided we ratify the amendments. And then the last petition is one that the Standing Committee and the Connectional Table will be working on in the upcoming months and years probably, which will update and perfect the regional conference structure. So that's what passed. The constitutional amendments will be what we'll be voting on at our upcoming annual conferences. So let me I did print out all of the legislation. It's 50 pages. We're going to send a link if you want to go and see every word that is changed. But I want to give you just a synopsis of what those changes do to within the, because you would be overwhelmed having to look at every time you change the word central to regional. I hope that you go and read them. I hope if you were at General Conference, you have already read them. But I'm just going to give you the synopsis of what each amendment would do. The first would establish the regional conferences for the work of the regional church. So it says this is how we will be established. We will have regional conferences for the work. And it specifies that none of them can be for anything other than geographic. So we're not going to have a regional conference that's set up on ideology, on race, on any of the things that you might have divided us in the past. It will only be geographical. The second is that General Conference will have the authority to legislate what is non-adaptable for regional conferences, and that would be by a 60% majority vote of the General Conference, respecting the powers that are given in the Constitution. The next amendments will state, and this is paragraph 28, and I just want to also mention that we ended up renumbering paragraphs. So that's something that's a little bit, it's important to, like, when we see the new discipline, those numbers will be numbered differently. But it states that the powers, duties, and privileges of regional conferences are to be exercised equitably across all regional conferences. So all conferences will have the same powers and duties. It would create a U.S. as a regional conference, because that has to be done by an amendment. We can't, that's not the way we're set up. So that has to be one of the amendments that is passed, and that all the central conferences would become regional conferences. And that, if you remember, we also we added a central conference at General Conference this year. So we would have then 8 central conferences that would now be regional conferences plus the U.S. The General Conference can change the number and boundaries of regional and provisional regional conferences. That's another part of of what we would approve with these constitutional amendments. Paragraph 31, which was probably the most significant changes that happened, that clearly states that each conference level within the constitutional limits has legislative functions. So it gives the regional conference legislative functions that that we would not have otherwise. Paragraph 31 also delineates the constitutional powers and duties that are conferred to the regional conferences. And these were brought into this paragraph. They already appeared in other places in the discipline. So already central conferences had some of these powers and duties, and the US had some, general conference had some, but these were brought together in this paragraph for clarity. It also gives regional conferences the ability to legislate as well as provide for rules and regulations for administration, and allows them to establish a regional discipline that would contain the legislation that pertains to that region, or annual district in charge conferences within its boundaries. And that would this includes qualifications and educational requirements for clergy and for specialized lay ministers. That's one of the things that has been designated for the regions. It would set standards and qualifications for the admission of lay members, and it reiterates that the annual conference is the basic body of the church, which has the authority to add to the requirements set forth in the regional discipline regarding credentialing of lay and clergy. That hasn't changed, but it states that. It also allows for the establishment and publication by the region of a regional hymnal, and that gives freedom to develop marriage and burial rights in accordance to the country laws and cultural understandings. This is a very contextual allowance, and so all of that is established in these amendments. And it allows the annual conference to adopt the structures that are adequate for their ministries, and they can make those changes while upholding their mandated entities. It also gives the regions the authority to adopt rules of procedure governing the investigation of clergy, bishops, and laity. And regions can change the chargeable offenses and their penalties. So those are the powers given to the regions. One of the other changes to the Constitution would also change that jurisdictions that the U.S. could have. It says now shall have jurisdictions. It would be changed to may have. So it allows that conversation to happen as we move forward with regionalization, where we decide to is our jurisdiction serving us best, and should they be expanded throughout the entire connection, or should we do some other way to should there be a different way? So we have that possibility that's there already, and we've changed it in the Constitution, which will be good no matter what happens in those decisions. So finally, I just want to say that this legislation has been approved, and there is one part of the legislation that was approved that is going to go forward because it does not require constitutional amendments, and that is the ability for the U.S. to have a regional committee that can already deal with some of its adaptable work. I don't think it's the ideal way, but it is a way that we can already begin to decenter the U.S., and I think it's important. I am certainly hopeful that we will pass and ratify all the amendments. But if it doesn't, this is kind of the backup plan, and it is already in place. It has passed. So I hope you will take the time to understand these amendments and then help others to understand them as well. And I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have. But what I really wanted to do is encourage you just to understand what we're doing and be able to help explain that to other people. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Judy. That was a lot in a short time.
Sorry.
And I'm sure there will be a few questions, probably more than we have time for today, but that gave us a good start, and I really appreciate that. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now, and regionalization is not the only thing we'll be voting on. So Emily Allen is going to talk to us about the next amendment.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I am talking about a petition that came out of the General Commission on Status and Role of Women, which I have been working with for the last 8 years. And in fact, this is a matter that G. Causer has been working on for more than 30 years to try to get into our United Methodist Constitution, and so far without success, but we are hopeful that this is a good time to take a fresh look at it. I'm talking about paragraph 4, article 4 of the Constitution. This article is titled Inclusiveness of the Church. The reason it exists is because even if we say all persons are eligible for membership, we know historically that certain categories of people have been excluded from membership. And so naming some specific categories as part of that overall inclusiveness helps remind us of our historical harms and reminds us of categories that do in fact need to be included in that all persons. And so that's kind of where that came from. And so, of course, from the General Commission on Status and Role of Women, the paragraph or the petition initially was suggested to add the word gender. The work of General Conference also added the word ability to this language. So with the amendment, the wording of that particular sentence would be all persons without regard to race, gender, ability, color, national origin, status, or economic condition shall be eligible to attend its worship services, participate in its programs, receive the sacraments, upon baptism be admitted as baptized members, and upon taking vows declaring the Christian faith, become professing members in any local church in the connection. So currently, gender and ability are not listed. Those are not categories that are reminded of their need for inclusion. The General Commission on the Status and Role of Women has in fact heard stories from women who say, you know, I was divorced and I was not allowed to become a member of my local church. I was not the first wife in, we live in a polygamous culture in my country, and I am not the first wife, and only the first wife is allowed to become a member. I am not allowed to become a member of my church. So G. Causer has been working, as I said, for more than 30 years to put in there explicitly, all persons means gender, means that gender should not be a reason to exclude. Some of the things that happen to women because of their gender should not be a reason to exclude people from membership in the church. This particular paragraph in the Constitution has a second part that talks about the programs and conference structures. That one we are not suggesting to add the word gender to, because we recognize that there are specifically United Women in Faith, United Methodist Men, other programs that are based on gender that is reasonable to have those kinds of categories. So the only place in this paragraph where the wording is proposed to be changed is having to do with the rights and responsibilities of membership and participation in the church overall. So I can put a link in the chat to some talking points that G. Causer put together. I have to apologize that these talking points are explicitly about gender and not about the word ability. Ability, as I said, was a word added by General Conference, added by the committee that dealt with this, and that legislative committee that dealt with this particular paragraph, and then approved by General Conference. And I have not yet seen updated talking points covering ability as well as gender. So these are just the talking points around gender, but I think can be broadened to say, you know, these are the reasons why we have to name all these different categories that we've historically had to name, because they've been marginalized and excluded. We did try this. I was part of the effort of trying to get an amendment to paragraph 4, article 4 passed after the 2016 General Conference. And there was slightly different wording of the additions of what words were going to be added in that particular amendment that was proposed. But some of the feedback that we got when it didn't pass at that time was people saying, oh, well, gender is really code for something else. You mean something by gender that's a secret meaning that you're not explaining here, and so we don't want to have that kind of secret code word in the Book of Discipline. Well, I'm here to tell you that in fact the word gender is used 64 times in the 2016 Book of Discipline, and in most of those 64 times it's used in reference to inclusivity, race, gender, age, economic status. So gender is not being redefined in this particular paragraph, in this particular amendment to the Constitution. It is simply being added as a category referencing the same word gender that is used in many other places in the Book of Discipline. So it's something that's been dear to my heart and on my work for the last 8 years. We did not manage to pass it after the 2016 General Conference, but we are hoping once again that we can add gender and ability to this list to remind ourselves of who really is everyone who can be included in and who cannot be excluded from membership, worship, and participation in local churches. So I'm probably shorter than my time limit, but I think that you get the point, and I just wanted to make sure that I gave you that context, gave you that understanding of what's being added, what's being proposed to be added, and it just, I don't know why it's taken this long, but we keep trying every time we have a general conference, and we'll keep trying if we need to, but I'm hoping that this one gets passed.
Thank you, Emily. That's a little more straightforward than the regionalization. And I appreciate you being here to explain that. Now that we've heard of the content of, oh, we've got one more to go. I almost skipped him. Reverend Gio Arroyo is going to talk to us about the last amendment that we'll be voting on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for the opportunity to share with you. Like Emily shared, Article 4 on inclusiveness, G-Corps presented Article 5 on racial justice. And so you can understand the background of where this rewrite came from. It came from the overt racism that we were experiencing as a nation in 2016, 2020, and the commission said it's time for us to provide even stronger language that really moves the church to be an anti-racist church. So what I want to do with you today is briefly go over the actual piece of legislation that passed, because there's only 5 words that stayed from the original 2016 Book of Discipline, and the rest is all new with stronger direct language. And so I'm going to break it into pieces and provide you what was the flow and thinking behind the sentences that we provide to General Conference. There's only 6 sentences. And it starts with, the United Methodist Church proclaims that from God's goodness and love, God created all persons as God's unique and beloved children. Racism opposes God's law, goodness, and love, and diminishes the image of God in each person. This was our way to start off this racial justice amendment with a very strong theological foundation of reminding that we are rooted in the biblical truth that all persons are created in God's image and they are uniquely beloved children of God. And this affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all people. But it also names right up front our opposition to racism as a sin. It emphasizes that racism is not merely a social issue, but a sin that opposes God's law, goodness, and love. That it distorts the image of God in every person and directly contradicts the core Christian teaching. And so that was the intent as we started this racial justice amendment. It follows with the next piece with acknowledging the historical injustice. It says, fueled by white privilege, white supremacy, colonialism, the sin of racism has been a destructive scourge on global society throughout the history of the United Methodist Church. It continues to destroy our communities, harm persons, obstruct unity, and undermine God's work in this world. One of the things that we try to do is to acknowledge immediately harm that the church has been part of in our history of racism and colonialism and white privilege and white supremacy. And it's important for us to recognize that through our history, when we look at our Methodist heritage, the moments where we have been active agents of that harm. But it also talks about the global impact that racism has as a destructive force that continues not only to impact the church, but also our global society. And naming that racial injustice across community and generations are being experienced through the different forms of harm, like tribalism and colonialism and white supremacy throughout the world. Then we followed with the next part of the amendment, names ways of how we're going to move forward to action and accountability and the commitment that we make as a church. And it says racism must be eradicated. Therefore, the United Methodist Church commits to confronting and eliminating all forms of racism, racial inequity, colonialism, white privilege, and white supremacy in every facet of its life and in society at large. The amendment did not stop at recognizing racism, but it calls for the eradication of racism in its all forms. And it includes confronting both the personal, but also personal prejudice, but also the systemic racism embedded in the institution, in our policies, in our practices that we continuously as a church practice and engage in. But it also is calling us to do the hard work of confronting white privilege and white supremacy. And as a church, we are called to explicitly commit ourselves to dismantle those realities that are faced by white privilege and white supremacy and colonialism, and acknowledge that our structures and to determine what in our structures need to be addressed so that we could then break the racial inequities that are being experienced by different communities across our church. But it is also calling us to commit as the United Methodist Church to be a leader in the movement of racial justice, calling for transformation not only within the church, but in society at large. So this amendment reflects the church's broader mission to bring God's justice and peace to the world. And so as we provided this, we saw that this amendment reflects the church's commitment to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ by standing against injustice and working for flourishing for all people. The thing about this amendment is that it really moves the church not only to speak it, but really to take on the action of what it means for us to be an anti-racist church. It envisions a future where the United Methodist Church becomes more inclusive, just and diverse, truly reflecting the kingdom of God where all are valued in love. So this new revised racial justice article amendment that you will be voting on is both a theological imperative, but also a moral responsibility that we are highlighting the need for recognition, action, and transformation to address racism and embody God's justice. So part of the work that GCOR will be doing to prepare any conference in this vote is that in the coming months, in beginning in January, we'll have a landing page specifically dedicated to educate people about Article 5. And part of it, it will have the talking points. It will provide also worship resources so local congregations could learn more about how the Article 5 is calling us to be an anti-racist church. There will be a video that will provide clarity about the historical point of why this change happened, what does it mean, and where do we see this new amendment guiding the church as we move forward in the next iteration of Methodism. And the goal is that also we will provide a video for annual conferences to consider as they go and vote for this amendment at their annual conference season. Once the amendment passes, because we are going to say that we as a church will vote and act with aggregated votes and moving this forward, we are committed to resourcing the church then with action Bible studies that will continue to educate our congregations about what does it mean to live into this racial justice work that we're called to do. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us as you engage in these conversations as we continue to develop these resources, your insights will be very helpful. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Gio. That's an amazing statement, and I hope we can really learn to live into it. We've now heard the amendments that we'll be voting on. A lot of the intended audience for this presentation was US people. Ratification work is already going on in the Philippines and in Africa. And we've invited Andy Emanuel to talk to us, and he has a whole 10 minutes to tell us what's happening with ratification in Africa. And Africa's a really big place. So give us the overview, Andy.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I am very grateful for this opportunity to connect with us this early morning here in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So I want to begin by sending our profound appreciation to the Western Methodist Justice Movement for the great work that you are doing and the support that you have been given to make sure that we are successful in this work of regionalization and ratification. We thank you so much for the financial support specifically that you have been providing for us. That has helped us a lot in doing a lot of work here in Nigeria and other parts of Africa as well. So thank you very much for that support. I want just to tell you that your support has been very helpful in bringing our delegates together in different locations to talk about these things. And again, I've been helpful in creating a platform whereby we engage our district superintendents, we engage our pastors for them to understand what is going on in the church and how what it means for us to be in a time of worldwide regionalization and how we intend to get these pieces of legislation ratified. So we are so much grateful for Western Methodist Justice Movement for this great work that you are doing. We have received a lot of testimonies that our church is beginning to understand what it means to be a regional church and how we intend to navigate around this in central conferences, most especially in Africa. So thank you for that. I want to encourage you to keep up this good work. We're not there yet until we're there. So God bless you for doing that. And on a positive note, let me share this with you. Before the General Conference met in Charlotte, many people expect that if worldwide regionalization is passed, Africa would leave the United Methodist Church, or Africa will be massively disintegrated. But I want to tell you that this has been proven to be false. After the General Conference and after regionalization has been passed, what we are seeing now is very encouraging than what we thought it will be. Many people have created this impression for people in America that when you pass the regionalization, then Africa is going to leave the United Methodist Church, or the church in Africa will be disintegrated because Africa will not be part of the church that will be regionalized. But if you take a look at the number and see what is currently going on in central conferences, specifically in the 3 central conferences in Africa, you get to understand that that has been proven to be false. Or let's look at it this way. When you look at the 3 central conferences, what is happening in those areas is very encouraging. Despite pockets of disruption that has been caused by the GMC, we have witnessed and see remarkable progress in our church, the way it has been, more than the way it has been in the past. Okay, take a look at the Congo Central Conference. In the entire Central Conference, in Congo, you get to understand that we have only issues in one annual conference, that is the Southern Congo. Even at that annual conference, when you take the statistic now, you get to understand that the majority of people in Congo Central, Southern Congo are understanding that regionalization is the best option for our church. So in the World Congo Central Conference, where we envision to see problem happening is only in Southern Congo. And with the information that we are providing on worldwide regionalization, people are beginning to understand that, yes, this is the right thing for the church, for us moving forward as a church. If you come back to Africa Central Conference, it's very positive and encouraging. In the entire Africa Central Conference, you have a pocket of issues only in southern part of Africa, in South Africa, or a little bit in Zimbabwe, where a just small portion of people decided to form their own traditional Methodist church. So we don't see any impact of disaffiliation in the Africa Central Conference. The only places we see problem is the West Africa. If you look at what is going on in West Africa, this is where the bulk of the work is. Look at what is going on in Sierra Leone. We don't expect much problem because Sierra Leone has been relatively calm, and we have been working with them along the line to ensure that credible information are provided against the misinformation and disinformation that is going on. So when you come back to Cote d'Ivoire, because of the language barrier, you get to understand that Cote d'Ivoire found itself in where it is now. Many of you know that Cote d'Ivoire joined the United Methodist Church in recent time and took the decision they have taken. But currently, we are working with the Cameroonian district of the Cote d'Ivoire Annual Conference and the Senegal district of the Cote d'Ivoire Annual Conference to ensure that we maintain this United Methodist that we have built in the Cote d'Ivoire. The district superintendent in Cameroon is giving us maximum cooperation to see that this has happened. And also the district superintendent in Senegal is doing the same thing. So now where the heat is Nigeria and Liberia. And let me talk a little bit about Nigeria. We don't have much problem about Nigeria. The things you see that are being published by the GMC or Wesleyan Covenant Association about Nigeria are only propaganda. To be realistic, when you see things that are on ground, you get to understand that the majority of United Methodists in Nigeria have already resolved long ago to remain United Methodists irrespective of the outcome of the General Conference. Our decision to remain in the United Methodist Church is not conditioned by whatever happens at the General Conference. We understand that as a church, we have to be faithful to our core. And we understand that we don't need to impose our own ideology on other people, the same way we wouldn't want other people to enforce theirs on us. So it's only the propaganda that the GMC and the Wesleyan Covenant Association are promoting about Nigeria. But the 4 annual conferences in Nigeria, by majority of vote, have resolved to remain in the United Methodist Church. Recently, the interim Bishop John Scholl, has appointed a list of 41 district superintendents. And these district superintendents are doing great work and amending where interruption or disruption of the GMC happened. And beside that, there have been a big number of United Methodists that disconnected themselves, though they keep the name United Methodist when Bishop Johanna was elected. They disconnected their relationship with the United Methodist Church. In that end, you will have more than 400 pastors and more than 500,000 United Methodists. These people have decided to come back after the bishop have left. So we have more good news to tell than the disruption that has caused by the GMC. Okay, look at Liberia. The same thing is going on in Liberia, where the GMC is is taking advantage of false information and misinformation and trying to cause confusion in the annual conferences. But thank God, our people, the lay leader of Liberia is with us here, and there are other leaders that are doing great job in educating our people to understand what it means to be a regional church and to stay connected with the United Methodists. So we are very optimistic that United Methodists in Central Conferences are understanding the need to be a regional church and the need to stay in connection together. So the only areas we see problem, as I've mentioned earlier, you see in South Congo, in pocket of two places in Zimbabwe, and the one we see in Nigeria. And if we are to take a vote, I tell people this, and this is realistic. If we are to take a regionalization vote in the meeting, the annual conference meeting that's scheduled for November, I'm telling you, we're going to pass regionalization by a high majority vote in Nigeria, because those who have made commitment to stay in the United Methodists in Nigeria are people who have understood regionalization and are staying and are giving that regionalization the required vote it needed. So we are working with our team in Liberia, as Liberian Annual Conference is coming next year. We're trying to work with them to ensure that we have that as well. So we have received positive responses than negative responses. So thank you very much for that which you are doing. God bless you.
Thank you, Andy. You did a great job of taking us all around Africa in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I'll just add a personal note here that I had the honor of serving with Andy and also with Judy on the conference's legislative committee at General Conference, and I just can't tell you what amazing people they both are. And I was grateful to be able to work with them. We're almost to our question and answer time. I know that a lot of questions have been put in the chat. Some of them have been answered already. Before we move into that, we're going to have a brief message from our sponsor, and Jason Takagi, who is the chair of our fundraising committee, is going to bring you that message.
Thank you, everyone, for coming and attending this. This has all been sponsored by the Western Methodist Justice Movement, which, as Jan said, she's our convener, and we try and bring webinars that we feel would be of interest to those of us here in the Western jurisdiction, but that could also possibly be used across the church. So if you would like to see more of these webinars, we definitely need your support in order to organize and schedule these. We are also currently raising money for grassroots efforts to promote regionalization in Africa. As Andy was saying, there are some parts of Africa which it is difficult for official church funds to be sent to. We know that there's an advance and there's some other official church funds that may be going out, but that's going to take time. And in some areas, that money just won't, official church money won't be able to get into those areas because of either issues with the bishop's office in Africa or others. And so the Western Methodist Justice Movement is dedicated to helping to support those of our grassroots partners in Africa and supporting their work to promote regionalization. So thank you all for joining us. I think we have had a really high turnout from what we were hoping for. So thank you.
And I believe that there will be a link in the chat for how you can donate to our cause of promoting justice, and in particular promoting education and work toward ratification across the connection. We're just about to our question and answer time. We want to reiterate a couple of points about voting, the importance of this. I mentioned the importance of choosing lay members to represent our congregations. We need to be sure those people are informed, and we hope that those of you that are not lay members of your annual conference will help educate the people who are. And if you are, that you'll help educate others who are. We also need to be sure that we've selected people who are actually going to show up for the vote. Sometimes I know in our conference, we have churches that aren't represented because, gee, we couldn't get anybody that would be there. So you need to push in every congregation to be sure that their representatives come and vote. And also, your conference probably has lay equalization members. Now, in our conference, that process is a little opaque, but as much as we can, we need to get in touch with those equalization members and make sure that, again, they are informed and that they show up to vote. And Richard is going to say a word about getting retired clergy to come and vote. And then I promise we're going to get to our Q&A.
All retired clergy in full connection are eligible to vote at annual conference. Many of them retire and we never see them again. But this would be the year to encourage them to come to annual conference because they can vote. And as we, with aggregate voting, the more people who come to our conference sessions and vote yes, the better. And like retired clergy are a large pool of folks that often don't come. I was suggesting when I was talking with Bob Rhodes earlier today that we should plan the ratification votes around something that retired clergy would like to show up for so that they can vote and do something that they would enjoy doing at the annual conference. I could beat a dead horse, but I think that's enough.
Thanks, Richard. So Izzy and Richard have been watching the chat for your questions, and I'm going to turn it over to them to point some questions to some of our presenters. And you guys go for it.
I don't know from Izzy's point of view. From my point of view, almost all the questions have been answered by our excellent panelists, either in the chat or mostly out loud. Do you see any outstanding questions, Izzy?
No, some of them we've answered in the chat. Some examples were, the 60% vote by general conference to, I guess, decide which can be adaptable and not adaptable. But also Judy mentioned that this is an ongoing work of really perfecting regionalization. So let me see. And we also have all the links to the amendments there. Maybe if we I'm not seeing any questions right now, but maybe our panelists could share what challenges they see in passing their own respective pieces of legislation. Like Emily mentioned, I totally know about that because we have some annual conferences in the Philippines that registered 0 votes on gender. I was just shocked. Thank God that bishop's no longer there. But they just created crazy stories about, oh, this is about transgender folks. Anyway, just if you have any challenges you see, now's the time to share it. If you see anything that,
there was a lengthy thread in the chat that maybe deserves some talking time about the issue of the powers that are reserved for the general conference as regional get new powers. Could one of you just cover that again?
Richard, paragraph 31.5. It's very clear what powers are to regions.
It's a really complicated question. I'm going to look at Judy, who I can see on my screen, and she and I may have differing viewpoints. which only goes to say that it's complicated, and we're going to both have to go back and read the actual constitutional amendments. So I would encourage you. The big picture is that we would be moving to a more Canadian model of constitutional governance. The US model is top down, one size fits all. The Canadian model is the provinces and the federal government have overlapping powers which they share, so there is much more flexibility and ability to share legislative ability. And that's what we're trying to move towards in, I would say, the constitutional amendments, is we're trying to have more of a sharing of power so that we can do more regional adaptations that make sense, and also along the way become less US-centric and less one-size-fits-all. Things like the social principles, the general agencies, apportionments will continue to be done church-wide. The sharing will mostly be in the area of what annual conferences and local churches can do. And Judy, please be kind to me because I'm sure I've made 5 misstatements already, but that's the general picture. Does that sound accurate to you, Judy?
I appreciate that you know something about the Canadian government, because I wouldn't have been able to give that analogy. Obviously, as we've been promoting it, you know, there are things that are not changeable, and that was really important, particularly, you know, with the social principles are in that area. I used to be able to delineate these very quickly, but all the things that are reserved for General Conference are significant things that we don't change. And what's adaptable, it's going to be very clearly part of Chapter 7 of the General Book of Discipline. It'll be outlined there. So I think that was one of the criticisms. Well, what's General Conference going to do? General Conference would now have the ability to focus on mission and ministry, that instead of dealing so much with just what comes out of the U.S. and the U.S. Legislation that dominates General Conference, and from the Central Conference perspective, that was what they were asking for. So they don't want to deal at General Conference with just what's happening in the U.S. and making everything be U.S. centric, and this allows us to not do that. So General Conference still has really important powers, really important responsibilities, but also now has a lot of opportunity that wouldn't have happened before. So that would be what I would like to say.
And I also would like to say, with regard to the other 2 constitutional amendments, if the constitutional amendment to Article 4 passes and the constitutional amendment to Article 5 passes, all of the regional conferences would have to operate within those constitutional requirements. They can't change, they cannot make regional changes contrary to the Constitution. General Conference can't make changes contrary to the Constitution. So there are some large guardrails that are going to govern everybody. And my own prediction is in 20 years, the Book of Discipline will be a lot shorter, because we'll have moved a lot more stuff to the regional books of discipline, where it probably better belongs in a contextual setting. But that's my own personal prediction. You know, how we organize the United Methodist Church in the U.S. and how we might best organize it in Africa or the Philippines is likely to turn out to be pretty different. Right now, we're trying to write something that governs everybody.
There's a question here asking, are these likely to pass now that many churches or a portion of churches have left, that were supposed to be more, I guess, centrist or moderate to progressive? I did answer that's probably the case in the US, but not in central conferences. And maybe Andy could explain more about, like, because there's this information connecting, for example, regionalization and same-sex marriage, the same way that an amendment on gender was trying to be connected to, like, oh, now this is about transgender people. There's misinformation out there. So anybody want to respond to that question. Is this easier to pass now because a lot of our more traditional siblings have left? Is this true?
I would say it was, I mean, I think that showed at General Conference because we passed them by such a large margin. However, I don't think we can assume that the US is this. I mean, I think it tends to lend we have a lot of our very conservative people have left a lot of the churches, but we still have a very broad church, and we really need to educate because we're having the same kinds of misinformation in the US that they're having in central conferences. Maybe not to the extreme, but I don't think we can take it for granted that the US churches and the members of our annual conferences in the US understand really what regionalization is, regardless of their position on the theological spectrum.
And in response to the question that I just saw in the chat, as I understand regionalization, which could result in some changes in requirements for clergy that vary from region to region, if you are elected, if you are an elder in full connection, or a deacon in full connection, or a home missioner, or whatever else status you have, that is recognized worldwide, even though the requirements may have some variance by region. So we would not have clergy that would only be recognized in the U.S. or clergy that would only be recognized in Africa. They would be recognized worldwide. That's my understanding. So I hope that answers your question, Jamie.
And there's a question for Andy. Is there this is probably also true for G Costro and G Corps. Is there any effort to educate our central conferences about the amendments on gender and anti-racism that's going on?
Right. Most of us that have been to the General Conference, one thing we understand is that these amendments are coming as a holistic amendment, and I think many of us are planning to deal with them at once, though we try as much as possible to provide information about the gender part of it, and I don't see where we have problem and people attaching the gender amendment to same-sex marriage or transgender. Maybe that has been in the past, but presently I don't see that happening. But there is education that is going on regarding the gender part of the amendment. And I want to say this: in the past, all these kind of amendment that we have done in the past have been micromanaged. Sometimes somebody stays and fill up those votes by one person, thinking that this is going to be the voice of everybody in the annual conference. But I want to tell you that this has changed. Ever since people begin to understand that the WCA, the African Initiative, have been micromanaging all this information in the past. But presently, this has changed. People are getting more and more informed, and we understand that part about gender inclusiveness as well as other part of regionalization. Thank you.
I was reminded about what regional conferences can and cannot do. I put it in the chat. There's a resource material there. Well, definitely the doctrinal standards, theological tasks, ministry of all Christians, and the social principles are not adaptable. So they can't, regional conferences cannot adapt those or touch them. Also, social principles are not law.
Can I address the question of the challenges that we face? As I know we've already kind of started out. One of those challenges is and this is true for all of the constitutional amendments, but the General Conference approves them, but then there is no funds allotted for education of those amendments. And those of you who have been around for a while and know we've gone through amendments at other times, and specifically in 2008 when we passed actually similar regionalization amendments, but they were after the General Conference passed them, there was no support for them whatsoever. No one explained them. They just they were not ratified, partly because they were just not explained and not pushed. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. However, we're doing that on already limited budgets, and I know the connectional table at this point has helped fund the conference that's going on right now in Africa, but we do not have that budgeted for us to do that, and so we paid for having someone from every annual conference there, and I'm very happy to do it, but we have set up in advance, and I don't want to compete with the information that came here because I know that is there, but there is an advance available that helps to support the regionalization amendments that will be in the training that will happen in Africa, in the Philippines, and also in the US. And I don't mention Europe because they are really doing this on their own very well, and they don't really need the extra support. But if they do, we'll have that available. So I hope at some point, Izzy, you can share that advance possibility with folks.
If we have the link, we can post it in the chat. That means we have, I think our bishops have received this. All annual conferences are being asked to donate. I see that Dr. Tolbert Nyensua is the lay leader of the Liberia Annual Conference and has joined. Are you in Liberia right now, Brother Tolbert?
I'm in the US right now.
Oh, okay, good. Oh,
going to Liberia maybe by the weekend. Yeah, by the weekend.
Could you, you raise your hand.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation from the presenters and my brother Andy. I hope you are with the guys in Tanzania for the conference. Thank you for working very hard on the continent for what we do. Judy, Rachel, the clarification really that we need to hammer down on is the whole issue of the social principle is not the church law, number one. It is not adaptable, but at the same time, we say it doesn't require two-third majority for ratification. So if those are correct, and then you get also the central conference have the approved, general conference approved to give the following additional authority to central conferences in Book of Discipline, paragraph 543, to set the standards and policy for rites and ceremonies for the solemnization of marriage, to set the standard for ordination and license and all of that. Then it gets a bit confusing. And this is where we who are in the central conference are having the confusion where the GMC guys are putting some, trouble into our own educational effort. You said social principle is not church law. Church laws are from chapter 1 to 5. They are not adaptable. Chapter 5 should include, I think, the social principle. How do you delineate? How can I tell my people that we are not bounded by this? It's not a church law, but yet at the same time, we cannot alter anything.
Okay, I'm turning this over to Jan. Well, there's one more question there. This is about how they do voting. I really don't know if we're gonna do.
Actually, Izzy, can I try to take a moment to answer Dr. Tolbert's question?
Yes, and then we'll give it to Jan.
And Dr. Tolbert, maybe you and I need to have a phone conversation so we can really discuss it in detail. I think that might be the most helpful thing. But the social principles are intended to be more aspirational and provide guidance. And the discipline tends to be more, this is the nitty-gritty of how we do church life. And how the two of them really work together is we've only struggled with since we had social principles for the last 50 or 60 years. It's an interesting, anyway, that's enough. Let me yield to somebody else.
Thank you, Richard. there was another question about hybrid voting, and I think, I believe Bob is not with us anymore. He was not able to stay for the whole 90 minutes, but I think that's just part of what we don't know yet. And hopefully when we have a new general secretary, that we will get answers sooner rather than later, but that's about all we can say right now.
Ratification is starting in February in some central conferences.
Mhm.
But we were told that the ballots will be ready. I don't know whether they're paper ballots or guidelines for electronic voting will be ready by the end of January
Oh,
2025.
I thought it was the beginning of January. Okay.
And my understanding is that there will be a way to submit them by paper by the conference secretaries. The way that the conference votes will be up to them. That's my understanding currently, but we don't, when the new secretary of general conference, she'll be able to make some of those decisions and then will inform us. But that's my understanding, is that the way the vote happens is up to the annual conference, but then it's reported back to the general conference on that official ballot that she will give us.
I certainly hope you're right, Judy. That's the most encouraging thing I've heard on that topic in a while. Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming, and Jason's gonna do a wrap up here, and we'll look forward to having more conversations.
Thank you to all of our presenters and our speakers. Thank you for, especially for those that came from quite a big distance. So thank you all. We want to remind you, don't forget that this was brought by the Western Methodist Justice Movement, and we would really appreciate your support to continue to bring social justice and related webinars to the church, and to allow us to continue to do the work of social justice within the Western jurisdiction and also beyond the church. We are very grateful for all of your donations and support, and thank you to all of those of you who on here that have already supported us. So thank you so much. I'm going to give us just a short closing prayer, and then we'll be done. Dear Lord, be with all of the people that are advocating and working on the constitutional amendments for ratification across the United Methodist Church. Be with those in Africa that are working to do this work as well, and those of us also in the Philippines and in Europe and in the United States. This is important work that we are engaged in, and help us to discern your will as we work throughout the world to bring the United Methodist Church to all of your children. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be posting the recording on the website, as well as the chart and other resources. So please go and take a look.